Long before she could read or write, Mary Prince learned to listen to the wind through casuarina trees, to the hush of tide over coral rock, to the low hum of grief that moved like a current beneath the surface of everyday life in Bermuda. She was born around the 11th of October, 1788, not in a cradle, but on a dirt floor in a one-room hut on the outskirts of Devonshire Parish, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Peggy and a man whose name she never knew. Her earliest memory wasn't of her mother's face, but of her hands, cracked from washing other people's clothes, yet gentle enough to braid Mary's hair each morning before sunrise. Even then, freedom was a word spoken in whispers, like a secret prayer. Not because it didn't exist, but because saying it too loudly might make you disappear. By the age of 10, Mary had already been sold twice. Her first owner, Captain Daryl, father of the later Mr. Daryl, gave her to his young daughter as a gift, a living doll to command and discard. When the girl grew bored, Mary was passed to another branch of the family, Robert Daryl and his wife, Sarah. It was in their household that the courtyard post waited. And it was there that Mary would learn the true meaning of public punishment, not as correction, but as theatre. It began with something small. Always something small. That morning in 1805, the air hung thick with the scent of frangipani and brine. Mary rose before dawn, as always, her bare feet silent on the cool stone path leading to the washhouse. She filled the copper tub with rainwater collected in barrels, fresh water was too precious for laundry, and added a spoonful of lye soap made from wood ash and fat. Then came the linen shift, fine, pale, embroidered with tiny roses along the collar. English made. Worth more than Mary's entire wardrobe. She handled it like a relic. She scrubbed the stain near the hem, a faint brown smudge, likely tea, with a soft brush, careful not to fray the threads. Rinsed it twice. Hung it in the dappled shade beneath the tamarind tree so the sun wouldn't yellow it. Pressed it with a warm flat iron wrapped in cloth. Folded it with corners sharp as knife edges. When she handed it to Mrs. Daryl after breakfast, the woman held it up to the light streaming through the parlor window. "This is still marked," she said, voice icy. Mary's throat tightened. "I did my best, Your best isn't good enough when it belongs to me. There was no trial. No witness. No chance to explain that the stain had been there when she received it. In the world of the Daryls, ownership meant infallibility. If the linen was imperfect, the fault lay with the hands that touched it, not the system that denied those hands rest, dignity, or recourse. "You'll be corrected," Mr. Daryl said at noon, appearing in the doorway of the kitchen where Mary was peeling yams. His tone was calm, almost conversational. "In the yard. After lunch." Her stomach dropped like a stone into deep water. They gathered quickly. First came the overseer, rolling up the cowhide whip, a thick, knotted thing cured in salt and blood. Then the house servants, Dinah the cook, old and bent but sharp-eyed, Thomas, who'd once slipped Mary a mango when she fainted from heat, Lisa, barely 12, trembling as she clutched a broom. Then the neighbors. A merchant paused his cart. 2 washerwomen leaned over the fence. Even the Daryl children, 8-year-old Eliza and 6-year-old Henry, were led onto the veranda by their governess, as if this were a lesson in morality. Mary was made to undress to the waist in front of them all. She kept her eyes down, but she felt every gaze like a brand. Shame burned hotter than fear. This wasn't just about pain, it was about erasure. They wanted to strip her not only of clothes, but of personhood. To reduce her to flesh and sinew, something that could be marked, controlled, displayed. The rope bit into her wrists as they tied her to the post. Cedar wood, smooth from years of use. She wondered how many backs had bled against it before hers. The first lash cracked like thunder. She didn't scream. She bit her lip until she tasted copper. The second came before she could exhale. The third split skin. By the fifth, her vision blurred. By the 10th, her legs gave way, but the rope held her upright like a puppet. 20 lashes. Each one counted aloud by the overseer, as if tallying sins. When it ended, she collapsed into the dirt, gasping. No one helped her. No one spoke. The crowd dispersed slowly, some shaking their heads, others chatting as if they'd just watched a play. Only Dinah lingered, dropping a folded cloth beside her, a scrap of clean cotton soaked in vinegar and aloe. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. No words. None were needed. That night, fever took her. She shivered under a thin blanket, her back throbbing like a second heart. Flies buzzed around the open wounds. She thought of her mother, sold to another island when Mary was 12. She remembered her last words, "Hold your head high, child. They can beat your body, but your spirit is yours alone." But what good was a spirit when your body was owned? The floggings became routine. Not weekly. Not even monthly. But unpredictably, whenever Mrs. Daryl was in a temper, whenever Mr. Daryl needed to assert control, whenever the system required a reminder of its power. Once, Mary was beaten for crying after a nightmare. Another time, for walking too slowly with a tray of tea. Once, simply because she looked defiant, which meant she hadn't lowered her eyes fast enough. Each punishment was public. Each audience larger. Neighbors began bringing chairs. Children were told, "Watch what happens to disobedient slaves." The spectacle served its purpose. It bred compliance through collective trauma. Those who witnessed it learned to police themselves, to swallow their anger, to smile when spoken to move like shadows. Mary stopped flinching, stopped pleading. But she never stopped feeling. The worst moment came months later. She'd been assigned to care for the Daryls' youngest daughter, a sickly infant. One night, the baby cried inconsolably. Exhausted, Mary rocked her gently, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung. At dawn, the child was quiet but feverish. By noon, she was dead. No one blamed illness. No one considered malaria or dehydration. They blamed Mary. She was dragged into the yard again. This time, 30 lashes. And this time, they forced the other enslaved women to watch, especially those who cared for children. A message: your love is dangerous. Your care is suspect. Your very presence is a threat. Afterward, she lay in the slave quarters for 3 days, drifting in and out of consciousness. Dinah fed her broth through a straw. Thomas brought herbs to stave off infection. No doctor came. Enslaved bodies were replaceable. But Mary survived. Not because she was strong, though she was, but because something inside her refused to be extinguished. Not rage, not hatred, but a quiet, stubborn certainty. This is wrong. And someone must say so. At 19, she was sold again, this time to Captain John Adams of the Turks Islands. The salt ponds there were hell on earth. Under a merciless sun, enslaved people raked crystallized salt for 16 hours a day, their feet blistered raw, their lungs burning from saline dust. Whippings were daily. Food was scarce. Water rationed. Mary worked until her hands bled, then worked some more. But even there, she found moments of resistance. She shared water with a pregnant woman. She taught a boy to recognize constellations so he'd never lose his way if he ran. She whispered stories of Bermuda, not the plantation, but the hidden coves, the wild guava trees, the sound of waves at midnight. After 5 years, she was sold once more, this time to John Woods, a merchant in Antigua. Antigua was different. There were free black communities. Churches where enslaved and free worshipped together. And whispers of a movement growing in England, abolitionists demanding an end to slavery. Mary listened. And hoped. In 1828, the Woods travelled to London for business and took Mary with them as a servant. She didn't know it yet, but she was stepping onto free soil. Under English common law, established since the 1772 Somerset case, slavery could not be enforced on British land. Though the law was murky and often ignored, it meant one thing. In London, no one could legally force her back into bondage. One cold November morning in 1829, after another scolding for laziness, she'd been up all night mending clothes, Mary walked out of the Woods' Bloomsbury townhouse. She didn't look back. She found refuge with the Moravian Church, then with the Anti-Slavery Society. There, she met Thomas Pringle, a Scottish abolitionist, poet, and secretary of the society. He listened to her story not with pity, but with urgency. "People need to hear this," he said. "Not as rumor, not as theory, but from someone who lived it." Mary hesitated. Who will believe a black woman? "Those who are ready to see," he replied. So she began to speak. Not in grand halls at first, but in drawing rooms, church basements, Quaker meetings. She described the linen shift, the post, the eyes of the neighbors, the silence afterward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't weep on cue. She simply told the truth, calmly, clearly, relentlessly. And people were shaken. In 1831, The History of Mary Prince was published. It was short, barely 60 pages, but it struck like lightning. For the first time, a British public read firsthand how slavery operated not just in fields, but in homes. How cruelty was domesticated. How punishment was performative. How women and girls bore the double burden of labor and sexual vulnerability. Critics called her a liar. Slaveholders sued Pringle for libel, and lost. But readers, especially women, wrote letters saying, "I will never drink sugar again without thinking of her." Mary never profited from the book. She received no royalties. But she gained something rarer, a platform. And she used it. She never returned to Bermuda. The law remained cruel, Though free in England, she was still legally enslaved under colonial statutes. To go back would mean re-enslavement, or worse. But in London, she built a life. She worked as a laundress, using the same hands that once scrubbed the Daryls' linen to earn honest wages. She attended chapel every Sunday. She befriended other formerly enslaved people, men and women who, like her, carried invisible scars. And she kept speaking. When Parliament debated the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, her narrative was cited in speeches. William Wilberforce's allies quoted her descriptions of public floggings as evidence that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but the enslavers and the society that allowed it. The act passed. On the 1st of August, 1834, slavery was abolished throughout most of the British Empire. But emancipation came with conditions: apprenticeships, delays, compensation paid not to the enslaved, but to former owners. Mary knew freedom was incomplete. But it was a beginning. In her later years, she lived quietly in a small room near Camden. She described the linen shift, the post, the eyes of the neighbors, the silence afterward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't weep on cue. She simply told the truth, calmly, clearly, relentlessly. And people were shaken. In 1831, the history of Mary Prince was published. It was short, barely 60 pages, but it struck like lightning. For the first time, a British public read firsthand how slavery operated not just in fields, but in homes. How cruelty was domesticated. How punishment was performative. How women and girls bore the double burden of labor and sexual vulnerability. Critics called her a liar. Slaveholders sued Pringle for libel, and lost. But readers, especially women, wrote letters saying, "I will never drink sugar again without thinking of her." Mary never profited from the book. She received no royalties. But she gained something rarer, a platform. And she used it. She never returned to Bermuda. The law remained cruel. Though free in England, she was still legally enslaved under colonial statutes. To go back would mean re-enslavement, or worse. But in London, she built a life. She worked as a laundress, using the same hands that once scrubbed the Daryls' linen to earn honest wages. She attended chapel every Sunday. She befriended other formerly enslaved people, men and women who, like her, carried invisible scars. And she kept speaking. When Parliament debated the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, her narrative was cited in speeches. William Wilberforce's allies quoted her descriptions of public floggings as evidence that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but the enslavers and the society that allowed it. The act passed. On the 1st of August, 1834, slavery was abolished throughout most of the British Empire. But emancipation came with conditions: apprenticeships, delays, compensation paid not to the enslaved, but to former owners. Mary knew freedom was incomplete. But it was a beginning. In her later years, she lived quietly in a small room near Camden.